Hi, Maddie and Eli. Daddy here. So today, something a little different. I'm going to read you a story from my first collection of short stories called Losing Henry. I haven't chosen this story for any particular um, literary merit or because it's a favourite. No, I've chosen it because it's short, and I hate reading my own work. It does look so pushy. Some of the short stories, of course, run to like 30 pages. This one's, I think, 5 pages, so a little more manageable. Anyway, I believe that good writing leads to clear thought, and so I thought I'd introduce you to my work. Like most people, of course, you know me as a musician, but I am, of course, a writer, although not as busy a one as I am a musician. And I don't see much difference between the two. There's a strong element of design in both. A well-written piece of prose or prosody uh, is like a brilliant orchestral score. Great orchestration is visible. Just look at a page of, say, Daphnis and Chloe or Debussy Image or even Rosenkavalier. Um, or sparingly, say, mature Mozart, the Requiem, perhaps, or Clemenza di Tito, or even our antecedent William Byrd, his choral polyphony. Just look at it. It looks beautiful on the page. So, anyway, here is.
She stood up where she had been planting geraniums and looked into the distance. Her grey-streaked hair ruffled in the breeze. She was smiling because she knew that in this light it still appeared as black and lustrous as a 25-year-old's, and she was 78. 78! That was old, she thought, but she didn't feel old. She looked at the sun, a fat red heart perched primly on the horizon's shelf, and wondered how old it was. Billions of years old, probably. Older than we can comprehend. 78 doesn't seem so old when you look at it like that, she thought. And after all, isn't the sun still in its prime? She couldn't remember it growing any duller. But then maybe the sun was being deliberately perverse and growing brighter in its dotage. She laughed at the idea, and the sound of her own voice startled her. Suddenly, she felt old. A woman in a garden, alone, planting geraniums. And it was not that comforting after all, she realized, to think of when she was young. At 25, she had been happy. Now, she was happy, but in a different way. Now happiness felt lonely, and the young don't understand lonely. They think it means being alone and feeling lost, but it means so much more. I have never understood loneliness, she thought, until this evening. 78 years old, planting geraniums, and suddenly I understand what lonely is. They'd put me in a home if they knew I was thinking like this. They were Helen's two sons, Joshua and Daniel. Joshua and Daniel were the perfect sons, in a textbook sort of way. They were both successful, both happily married. They visited with their own children every few months or so, helped her financially, shifted heavy objects that needed shifting. But they were distant. Helen hadn't expected anything different, of course. They had their own families, their own lives. But why did they have to grow more distant the older she became? Was this a way of ensuring that her death caused minimum disruption to their carefully constructed, loving homes? If Joshua and Daniel could do a thing like that, she realized, then all families must do it. But that didn't change the fact that it was a barely concealed emotional withdrawal designed to protect themselves, their families, and abandon her. It was cruel, she decided, and perhaps it said something about Joshua and Daniel that she had never cared to hear. Even as children, they had been fiercely independent. They refused, one Halloween, 35 years ago, to wear the costumes she had spent a fortnight working on, preferring instead to decimate their bedsheets with filthy secateurs and little pots of red paint, stolen, undoubtedly in advance, from their school art room. That year, as in many others, they had also refused to take their sister trick-or-treating. She was too young, she said. "We'll be a laughing-stock, mother." And besides, Abby's puppyish legs could never keep up with their Doberman strides. That much was true. And so Joshua and Daniel went out to lick their hands clean of chocolate and toffee apples, cinnamon whirls and whipped cream, while Helen attempted to placate young Abby with fantastical yet forlorn costumes, many sizes too large for her. Every Halloween, the house trilled inconsolably. With a delicate shiver, Helen realized she was crying. She also realized that, contrary to popular belief, weeping was not something that grew easier with age. Age made it seem more natural, perhaps, but Helen couldn't remember the last time she'd cried, somewhere in all those bright days and black nights that made up her life. As she wiped her eyes, she caught the smell of geranium on her fingers, and she remembered reading somewhere, National Geographic, about bizarre deep-sea fish, so vibrantly coloured that no words could possibly describe them. That was what the smell of geranium was to her. Though she'd known it all her life, she could never find the words to describe it. She'd often wondered about the fish, though, when she was younger. Were they bright because it was black in the depths of the ocean? She didn't think so, because then surely bigger, fiercer fish could see them more easily and snap them up before they swam off. Even Helen knew there was logic in genetics. What she liked to think was that animals who lived in obscure places, like the bottom of the Atlantic, the top of the Alps, or the poles, could afford to be beautiful because human eyes so seldom saw them. She knew it was a romantic view, as her sons never ceased to remind her. "Oh, mother, you're so romantic. You have such a quirky view of things." But that didn't necessarily make it untrue, did it? She had been standing that way in the garden for 11 minutes when the telephone began to rattle. Helen looked at where the sun had been, noticed that it had faded to orange and begun to fall weightlessly into the earth, turned and walked towards the house, stepping carefully over the new geraniums. The ringing stopped the moment her fingers reached the handset. This was happening more and more often. She wondered vaguely if it was somebody's idea of a joke, or if it was her son's way of avoiding an actual conversation, which would involve time and money, though neither of these, so far as she knew, were in short supply. Her sons had never suffered material problems, or problems of any kind, for that matter. Perhaps, Helen thought, if you believed strongly enough that nothing would go wrong, then nothing did go wrong. It hadn't been like that for her, of course, but then the world in which her sons had grown up was so radically different from her own that it sometimes seemed impossible to imagine them coexisting. "I had a daughter once," she whispered, watching the words disappear as she uttered them. It was only when she thought of Abigail that Helen ever considered smoking again. Abigail had helped her to give up shortly before she died, and somehow after that it had never seemed right to light up again. Abby was like that when she helped you with something, and in many ways she spent her whole life helping others. You never went wrong again. That was Abigail's gift. Too much love? Too much happiness? Abigail had always been happy and loving. Everyone loved Abby. And then she killed herself, and no one would believe it. When Abs was 7 and all elfin teeth and unruly hair, Helen had tiptoed to her daughter's room and, after the third call to supper went unanswered, nudged the panelled door ajar. Abby was at the window, seemingly transfixed by a series of moving lights across the street that Helen could not distinguish until she moved forward into the room across the tufted green carpet. The lights came from a huge and newly installed fish tank in the window opposite Abby's, a rich kid's birthday present, no doubt. From what she could make out, it was at least a foot high and 3 feet wide, and moving beams of light fixed in its base strobed upwards through the water. The beams illuminated first foliage, then tank furniture, an oddly angled castle, a scaled-down Stonehenge. And what fish! All colours, lilac and aquamarine, topaz and primrose, in myriad shapes. For a dark suburban street, the sight was so extraordinary that Helen's first instinct was to avert her gaze. Her cheeks were stinging as if she'd witnessed a supremely private act. But before she could reach for her daughter, Abby had turned and was in her mother's arms, clinging passionately to her. "Abby?" said Helen, with uncertainty. "Oh, Mother, aren't they beautiful, beautiful?" she sobbed. She was like me, thought Helen. She was more like me than Josh or Dan. She was more like me than me. Where did we go wrong, Abigail? Helen realized she was crying again. Not for years and then twice in one night. She giggled, it sounded so rude. Wiping her eyes with a tissue, she changed into shoes, muddy Wellingtons left out on the patio, selected a raveling maroon sweater from the closet and pulled it on. One thing arthritis couldn't do, it couldn't force you to change your dress sense. She knew it would be easier to wear button-up blouses, to dress like an old lady. "You've never dressed your age, have you, Mother?" But Helen had worn trousers and sweaters for as long as she could remember, and she sure as hell wasn't changing now, pain or no pain. Not bothering with a creased brown handbag on the chair by the door, she merely set off with her keys in one hand and a crumpled £5 note in the other. It was about 300 yards to the local shop, but what with 2 busy roads to negotiate along the way, it always took her a good few minutes there and back. From an upstairs window on the opposite side of the street, a small, wan boy who had been playing with his army torch, flicking its light on and off into the darkening sky, dipped his ballpoint eyes and watched as she left the house. It seemed to him that the shaded figure out there was neither male nor female, human nor ghost, and he held his breath as it passed along the leafy pavement and, at the corner, turned. Slipping behind his Star Trek curtains, he imagined that the apparition smiled at him and beckoned, as though with the hand it lifted to its face, it reached into his soul and said, "Never forget." And though he couldn't explain why, he knew that night would stay with him always, as the first common miracle of his life. At the corner of her street, with shop lights twinkling from the town centre, Helen turned and scratched the side of her face. She ran her almost square nails through the soft hair beside her lips. 10 years ago, under dusky skies, she could have made out her house, but they had all merged and appeared now as an unending slag heap. Meine Heimat, dead coal, she thought and smiled, imagining life as an imperial guard in one of the turrets on the Great Wall of China. And why stop there? Why not the Empress of Asia with gold braid and horsebox headdress? "Evening, Mrs. Albright," said Chris Nicholson Jr., who had kept the village shop on its toes every day since his father's retirement into alcoholism 20 years before. "Evening, Chris? Bit late for you, isn't it, Mrs. Albright? What can I get you?" Helen decided that his first question was rhetorical and thus ignored it, but the second, if only Josh could see her, if Dan could hear. She found, suddenly, that she had little faith in either of them, but she knew what Abigail would have done. As she scanned the newspaper headlines, 300-billion-year-old rock holds key to life on Mars, smoking prevents Alzheimer's, she understood completely why her daughter had died. It was not that Abigail wasn't ready for the world. It was the world's fault. The planet was not ready for Abigail. Abigail knew that, and 20 years too late, Helen knew it too. It was almost romantic. She smiled at the realization. "Mrs. Albright? Mrs. Albright, are you okay?" Chris Nicholson Jr. was staring at her sweatily. She was crying again, and her hands were trembling, but her mind was clear, and she gave the only acceptable answer. "I'm sorry, Chris, dear. It's just old age." "Don't worry, dear. Just age. Simple age." She took her change and left the shop, the smell of geranium still on her fingers. But for the Bible paper skin, she thought, these hands could be Abigail's. As Helen lit her first cigarette for 20 years and felt relief like luxury flood her body, the sun disappeared completely into the earth with a faint hiss. Helen looked ahead and stepped into the road.